The last sliver of the sun bled out, painting the sky in violent streaks of tangerine and bruised purple over the desert canyon at twilight. I watched it from the dome's small observation slit, a ritual I performed every evening. It was a stark reminder of the vast, indifferent universe I sought to understand, and of my own profound isolation within it. My observatory, a solitary sentinel of steel and glass, clung to the canyon rim like a barnacle, miles from the nearest paved road. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminated by the glow of my monitors, a silent ballet in my personal sanctuary. My life was a precise calibration of data streams and solitude. I had built this place, brick by brick, algorithm by algorithm, fueled by a singular, unyielding obsession, to hear the universe speak. Not the static hum of cosmic background radiation, nor the rhythmic pulse of distant stars, but something more. Something that hinted at structure, at intent, beyond the predictable physics of stellar nurseries and galactic collisions. For years, my colleagues, those few I still interacted with, had dismissed my pursuits as quixotic, my instruments as overly sensitive. They preferred the comforting certainties of established models. I, however, found comfort only in the unknown. Tonight, like every night, I was hunched over the primary console, fingers dancing across the haptic interface. The air hummed with the soft thrum of machinery, the only constant companion to my thoughts. My current project involved sifting through terabytes of captured radio emissions, looking for anomalies, for patterns that shouldn't exist. It was like searching for a single, perfectly cut diamond in a mountain of gravel, but I had always possessed an almost preternatural patience. My focus was absolute, my determination a rigid backbone against the crushing weight of cosmic silence. The main screen glowed with a cascade of spectral data, a waterfall of wavelengths and frequencies. For the most part, it was noise, the predictable clamor of the cosmos. Then a flicker, a deviation. My breath hitched. It wasn't the usual burst of gamma rays from a distant supernova or the subtle wobble of an exoplanet. This was different. My fingers flew, zooming into the anomalous band, isolating the signal from the background din. The initial readouts were perplexing. The energy signature was faint, incredibly distant, originating from a region of space previously considered devoid of complex activity. What truly jolted me, however, was its structure. It wasn't random, not chaotic. It was ordered. My mind, trained to dissect and categorize, struggled to reconcile the data with any known astrophysical phenomenon. The signal exhibited a nested complexity, a kind of fractal pattern in its modulation that defied conventional mathematical analysis. It was like listening to a symphony composed in a language I couldn't yet comprehend, but whose intricate harmonies resonated with an unsettling familiarity. A jolt of pure, unadulterated scientific excitement surged through me. This was it. The culmination of decades of solitary work, the vindication of every dismissed theory, every late night fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unshakable belief. I felt a giddy lightness, a sudden rush of adrenaline that sharpened my senses. This wasn't just a discovery, this was the discovery. My hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I initiated a deeper analysis protocol. The algorithms churned, processing the raw data, attempting to find a match in the vast libraries of astronomical data. Nothing. Zero correlation. This signal was unique. It stood apart, a solitary peak in a flat landscape of expectation. The excitement, however, began to curdle subtly into something else, a prickle of unease like an insect crawling just beneath my skin. The signal's complexity wasn't just remarkable, it was too perfect. It felt engineered, yet on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity could conceive. I ran a series of integrity checks, cross-referencing with other observatories' public data streams. Still nothing. No one else had detected it. Was it a fluke, a localized interference? I systematically eliminated every terrestrial source, every instrumental error. The signal persisted, unwavering, its intricate pattern echoing in the digital void. It was real, and it was coming from out there. The signal wasn't just from beyond known space, it felt beyond comprehension. It wasn't merely unknown, it felt fundamentally other. As I stared at the shimmering patterns on the screen, a bizarre thought began to take root. This wasn't just information, it was a presence. A silent, intricate voice speaking in a language woven from reality itself. A language so ancient and vast that its very existence hinted at a terrifying, indifferent scale of being. I wasn't just listening to the universe anymore. I felt like the universe was listening back. It was a stark reminder of the vast, indifferent universe I sought to understand. A universe that had, until recently, felt comfortably distant. But now, with the signal humming through my equipment, that distance felt less like a buffer and more like a thin membrane. I didn't linger tonight. The hum from the console, a low, persistent thrum against the quiet of the desert, pulled me back. It had been weeks since I'd properly slept. My eyes felt like they were packed with sand, gritty and burning, each blink an effort. My reflection in the darkened console screen showed a gaunt face, shadowed and pale, framed by hair I hadn't bothered to cut or wash in what felt like an eternity. User Excel, the brilliant astrophysicist, was becoming a ghost in my own machine. The signal, it was everything. Every waking moment and what few fragmented dreams I had revolved around its intricate, maddening patterns. I was fueled by lukewarm coffee, stale energy bars, and an almost manic determination that gnawed at me from the inside. I'd stopped going outside, even for my evening ritual, often catching the sunset only through the peripheral vision of my monitors. The desert canyon at twilight was a memory, a backdrop to the real work happening within the dome's metallic shell. My isolation, once a comfortable solitude, had begun to fray into something more sinister. Every creak of the dome structure, every gust of wind whistling around its seams, now sounded amplified, charged with a subtle menace. I found myself pausing, head cocked, listening, convinced there was another sound, something just beyond the range of normal hearing. A whisper, perhaps, or the soft scrape of something moving outside. I knew it was absurd. There was nothing out here for hundreds of miles, just sand and rock and the occasional scuttling creature. But the thought, once planted, took root and began to sprout. I started checking the locks on the main hatch more often, sometimes twice in an hour just to be sure. A ridiculous compulsion, yet I couldn't shake the prickle of unease that settled between my shoulder blades. One evening, as I was fine-tuning the spectral analysis, a flicker caught my eye. It wasn't on the main signal display, but on one of the secondary monitors, showing ambient static. For a split second, a shape resolved itself from the noise, a complex geometric configuration, too intricate to be random interference. Then just as quickly it dissolved back into a mess of digital snow. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and leaned closer. Nothing. Just the familiar hiss and shimmer of white noise. Sleep deprivation, I told myself, a trick of the light, an overloaded visual cortex. It had felt too real, too deliberate. The real breakthrough, or perhaps the beginning of the end, came 3 days later. I had been feeding the raw data through an experimental algorithm, one designed to identify non-linear, self-replicating patterns, essentially looking for a fingerprint of intelligent design that didn't conform to any known terrestrial mathematics. Hours blurred into a single agonizing vigil. My head ached with a dull, persistent throb. The air in the dome felt thick, heavy with my own stale breath and the hum of electronics. Then, the algorithm flagged something. Not a sound, not a visual image, but a pattern of absence. A series of precisely timed minute fluctuations in the background radiation that, when isolated, formed a complex, repeating sequence. It wasn't a message in the traditional sense. A negative space that spoke volumes. My fingers, trembling slightly, zoomed in on the anomaly. The pattern was incredibly intricate, almost fractal in its complexity, yet utterly devoid of any recognizable numerical or linguistic structure. It was pure information, conveyed through what wasn't there. This wasn't a distress call or a greeting, it felt. Indifferent, like a cosmic signature, a watermark left by something so utterly vast and ancient that it didn't bother with communication. That's when I heard it again. It wasn't the wind. It was more like a sigh or the rustle of dry leaves, but there were no leaves in the dome or for miles around the desert canyon at twilight. I spun around, my heart racing, convinced someone was behind me. The empty expanse of the dome stretched out, sterile and silent. Absolutely nothing. The discovery of the pattern of absence was a victory, yes, but it felt more like an invitation to a horror I was only just beginning to comprehend. And I couldn't stop. I couldn't even consider it. The signal had become my master, and I, its willing, terrified servant. An invitation to something I was only just beginning to grasp. The invitation wasn't just to a deeper understanding. It was to a fundamental shift in perception, a rewiring of the very lenses through which I viewed the world. The morning after the pattern of absence revelation, the ordinary began its subtle rebellion. My coffee mug, a familiar ceramic cylinder with a chipped rim, sat on my desk, but the way the light caught its curve felt wrong. Not just a trick of the eye, but an intrinsic wrongness, as if its very form was momentarily unstable, a geometry held together by a thread. I picked it up, feeling its weight, its warmth, yet my fingers registered a fleeting sense of unreality, a phantom texture that wasn't quite there. It was like seeing a perfectly rendered image that, upon closer inspection, revealed a single, impossible pixel. This wasn't a one-off. The shift started small, then grew more insistent. A walk to my car became a strange ballet of altered distances. The pavement stretched and compressed. A familiar lamppost seemed to lean at an unnatural angle, only to snap back into place when I blinked. The sound of a distant siren would echo for too long, then abruptly cut out, leaving a void where the sound should have decayed naturally. My own reflection in the rearview mirror was the most unsettling. For a split second, my eyes seemed too wide, too ancient, holding a depth of knowledge that terrified me. Time, too, became a slippery thing. A 10-minute drive felt like an hour, filled with an inexplicable sense of waiting, of suspension. Then a complex calculation that should have taken me hours would resolve itself in minutes, the steps appearing preordained, already known. The fluidity was disorienting, leaving me constantly adrift in a present that refused to anchor itself. I started seeing them everywhere, the anti-patterns, the absences that defined the signal. Not just in data, but in the mundane fabric of existence. The books on my shelf, arranged by subject and size, suddenly presented a different kind of order. The gaps between them, the negative space, seemed to coalesce into a series of stark, angular symbols, fleeting glyphs that vanished if I focused too hard. A shadow cast by a hanging coat in my hallway stretched across the floor, but its edge didn't quite align with the light source, creating a sliver of impossible darkness. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible dissonance, like a single note played just a fraction off-key in a symphony. These weren't illusions, not exactly. They felt more like revelations, glimpses into the true underlying structure of reality, a structure that was far more porous and indifferent than I had ever imagined. My mind, once so adept at finding order, was now being shown the terrifying lack of it, the inherent meaninglessness woven into the very threads of being. The isolation deepened with each passing day. I tried once to articulate what was happening. I sought out a senior researcher, someone I respected for their grounded, pragmatic approach. We met in the break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of stale coffee thick in the air. "I've been seeing things," I started, trying to keep my voice even. "Patterns, or rather anti-patterns. Gaps. In the data, yes, but also everywhere else. In objects, in time itself." The senior researcher, a man with kind eyes and a perpetually furrowed brow, listened patiently, stirring his tea. "User XL," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've been working non-stop on that signal. It's groundbreaking work truly, but you're exhausted. Your mind is probably just processing all that complex information, trying to find connections where there aren't any. It's a common psychological response to intense focus and sleep deprivation. He offered me a sympathetic smile, a suggestion to take a break, get some rest. He even recommended a short vacation. His words were logical, rational, a comforting blanket of normalcy, but they felt utterly alien to me. He couldn't see what I saw. He couldn't feel the world subtly unraveling. His understanding, however well-intentioned, was a wall, not a bridge. I nodded, mumbled something about considering it, and left, the fluorescent hum now feeling like a high-pitched, mocking whine. The encounter only amplified the terrifying truth. I was alone in this. The desert canyon at twilight called to me then, an undeniable pull. I drove for hours, the setting sun painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The familiar landscape of scrub brush and rock formations seemed to ripple in my peripheral vision, the edges of the mountains blurring against the deepening sky. The road, a ribbon of asphalt I'd driven countless times, felt like a foreign entity, a path laid by something unknowable. The vastness of the desert, usually a source of peace, now mirrored the emptiness I felt within. When I finally reached the canyon overlook, the last vestiges of daylight clung to the highest peaks, casting long, grotesque shadows that writhed across the canyon floor. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. I stood at the precipice, gazing into the chasm, and the world shifted. The rock faces, ancient and immutable, seemed to breathe, their striations pulsing like veins. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the impossible, to reconcile the solid ground beneath my feet with the liquid, shifting reality before my eyes. The signal wasn't just warping my mind, it was warping everything. And I, user XL, was merely a conduit, a witness to its unraveling. The colleague's concerned words had dissolved into the hum of the lab's ventilation system, utterly irrelevant. He'd seen a tired astrophysicist, overworked, perhaps a little too obsessed. He hadn't seen the burgeoning comprehension behind my eyes, the dawning, terrifying clarity. His suggestions for rest, for a break, were like trying to mend a collapsing star with a band-aid. The signal wasn't a problem to be solved with sleep. It was a fundamental truth demanding to be understood, regardless of the cost to my own fragile sanity. I left the lab, not for home, but for the edge of everything I knew. My old truck rumbled over the cracked asphalt, then onto the gravel, kicking up dust plumes that glowed briefly in the last vestiges of daylight. I needed space, a vast emptiness to match the one growing inside me. I drove until the city lights were a faint shimmer in the rearview mirror, until the air grew thin and the silence pressed in. I found myself in a desert canyon at twilight. The colossal walls of ancient rock rose around me, a silent, indifferent audience. The sky bled from bruised purple to deep indigo, the first pinpricks of stars appearing cold and distant. I killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the frantic thrumming of my own pulse. I pulled out my portable display, the screen a small, artificial glow in the encroaching gloom. The latest patterns from the signal shimmered there, a complex tapestry of frequencies and modulations I'd spent countless hours trying to untangle. But tonight, something was different. The lines, the curves, the sudden spikes and troughs, they weren't just data points anymore. My fingers traced a particularly intricate sequence on the screen. It was a pattern I'd previously dismissed as noise, an anomaly. Now, looking at it under the vast, uncaring vault of the desert canyon at twilight, it resolved itself. It wasn't noise. It was the fundamental structure. It was the negative space around existence, given form. The communication wasn't a language, not in any sense I understood. There were no words, no symbols, no intentions. It was a direct bypass of my cognitive functions, a pure influx of understanding that flooded my consciousness. It wasn't coming from the screen. It was coming through it, using the patterns as a key to unlock something dormant and terrifying within my own mind. It was an anti-existence, not an entity that opposed existence, but one that was its very foundation through absence. It wasn't conscious, didn't think, didn't feel, didn't even exist in any way a living thing did. It was the silent, eternal hum of meaninglessness, the ultimate truth of the universe. My scientific training, my entire life's dedication to understanding the cosmos, fractured in that moment. I had believed in laws, in discoverable truths, in a grand, intricate design. I had sought purpose among the stars. There was no grand architect, no hidden meaning, no cosmic consciousness to decipher. There was only this anti-existence quietly, eternally eroding the very concept of purpose. My hands trembled, the portable display threatening to slip from my grasp. The cold air of the desert canyon no longer felt invigorating. It felt like the breath of the void itself, seeping into my bones. My identity, User XL, the brilliant astrophysicist, the seeker of knowledge, felt like a flimsy construct, a temporary illusion built on a foundation of sand. If everything was built upon an indifferent anti-existence, then my theories, my discoveries, my very consciousness were merely fleeting patterns, temporary disturbances in an otherwise eternal blankness. My life, my hopes, my fears, they were all utterly meaningless against the backdrop of this horrifying truth. A profound, soul-numbing nihilism settled over me, heavier than any physical weight. The stars above, now brilliant against the inky black, no longer sparked wonder. They were just points of light burning themselves out in an endless, purposeless dance. The beauty of the desert canyon at twilight, the majesty of the cosmos, all of it became a cruel joke. It was all a temporary flicker, soon to be swallowed by the silent, indifferent principle that truly governed reality. And I, User XL, was just another flicker. The unraveling my colleague had sensed was no longer subtle. It was a complete, devastating collapse. His suggestions for rest, for a break, for perspective were laughable. Perspective. I had all the perspective now, more than anyone could possibly bear. I found myself in the desert canyon at twilight, the air cooling rapidly, pulling the day's heat from my skin. The sandstone walls, sculpted by millennia of wind and water, bled from ochre to deep rust as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. Long, creeping shadows stretched across the canyon floor, obscuring familiar contours, making the world seem to fold in on itself. A faint, dry scent, like pulverized rock and ancient dust, hung heavy. The silence here was profound, a vast, echoing emptiness that swallowed every rustle of the sparse scrub, every distant cry of a nocturnal bird. It should have been calming, this immense, indifferent expanse, but it only amplified the cacophony within my skull. My hands, I noticed, were trembling as I fumbled with my worn notebook and a pen. The paper felt rough, familiar, a last tether to the structured world I once inhabited. I needed to write it down, all of it. Before the clarity, this terrible, beautiful insight slipped through my fingers like sand. Before I slipped, I bent over the open page, the last vestiges of natural light fading fast, forcing me to squint. My plan was simple: record the progression, the signal's evolution, the revelations. Piece by piece, the way a scientist builds a theory. But the words wouldn't form, not in the old way. My mind, once a precise instrument, now felt like a shattered mirror reflecting countless impossible angles. Pattern recognition, the illusion of causality, a comforting fiction. The thoughts weren't mine, not entirely. They were interwoven, a counterpoint, a bass note vibrating beneath my own frantic mental scramble. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but a pervasive knowing, an undeniable presence that reshaped my internal landscape. I tried to write, the signal initially believed to be. My hand froze, believed. What was belief in the face of absolute, indifferent truth? Belief is a construct, a tool for navigating limitations. Observe, my pen hovered. I looked at the canyon walls, the deep crevices and overhangs. They seemed to ripple not physically but perceptually. A trick of the light, I told myself, but the voice offered a different explanation. The observer defines the observed. Eliminate the observer and the definition dissipates. The form remains unburdened. I started sketching instead. A line, then another, intersecting at an angle that felt profoundly wrong, yet undeniably correct. I drew a triangle, then tried to define its interior. It seemed to expand, to fold into itself, the sum of its angles fluctuating wildly with each glance. Non-Euclidean geometry, yes, but not just on paper. It was in my head, a fundamental rewiring of spatial understanding. My own internal space felt vast, yet compressed simultaneously. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cooling air. The paper blurred. I tried to focus, to force the old logic back into place. This is real. I am user XL. I am documenting. Identity is a narrative, a sequence of perceived moments. Disconnect the sequence. Observe the disconnected. My hand moved seemingly on its own accord, etching symbols I had never seen before. They weren't letters or numbers. They were intricate, interlocking glyphs, each one a miniature diagram of an impossible concept. A spiral that ended where it began, yet continued outwards. A series of parallel lines that converged and diverged without ever meeting. They pulsed with a silent, terrifying meaning that I understood perfectly, even as my conscious mind recoiled. These were not human symbols. I need to explain. Explanation implies a recipient, a shared understanding. There is no shared understanding. There is only the observed and the observation. I pressed the pen harder, tearing the paper slightly. The entity. It is not hostile. It is simply. Correct. Hostility is a human projection, an emotional response to perceived threat. There is no threat, only existence and its absence. The words on the page morphed from my desperate attempt at scientific notation to fragmented philosophies of cosmic horror. My neatly lined paper became a canvas for a burgeoning madness. Meaningless, I scrawled the word huge and jagged, all of it, the striving, the love, the fear, just. Noise. Noise is a vibration, a fleeting disturbance in the stillness. Significance is assigned. Remove the assignment. I felt a laugh bubble up, harsh and dry, a sound I barely recognized as my own. It wasn't a laugh of joy or even despair, but of a profound, horrifying release. The signal hadn't revealed meaning, it had erased it. It had shown me the vast, empty chasm beneath all human endeavor, all human emotion. The last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the canyon into deep twilight, the sky above a bruised purple. The air grew sharp, frigid. My notes were a jumble now, a doodle of a hypercube that seemed to twist and untwist on the page. A series of dots connected by lines that formed no discernible shape, yet implied a terrifying connection. And then a single, stark sentence, written in a hand that was both mine and utterly alien. I am a ripple in a forgotten pond. The pond cares not for its ripples. My name, user XL, felt like a distant echo, a word with no substance. My identity, my purpose, my very self were dissolving. I wasn't just observing the entity, I was becoming a lens for its indifferent gaze. And so was I. The frantic desire to document hadn't vanished, but the reason for it had. Now it was just an impulse, a reflex, like a dying star still radiating light, unaware of its own obliteration. My name, user XL, felt like a distant echo, a word with no substance. The canyon walls, the deepening shadows, the vast starless sky that was beginning to emerge in the desert canyon at twilight, all of it felt less like a backdrop and more like an extension of my own dissolving perception. The air, previously a crisp breath of dust and cool stone, now tasted like static, a metallic tang that vibrated behind my teeth. My fingers, still clenched around the remote console, felt alien, the plastic a strange, dead thing under my touch. The signal, which had been a whisper, then a hum, was now a roaring current in my skull. It wasn't a sound, not really, but an imposition, a direct neural tap. Every fiber of my being was a conductor channeling something immeasurably vast. I remember dimly setting up the array. The painstaking calibration, the precise angles, the countless hours spent ensuring every component was perfect. Now the equipment around me, the dishes, the processors, the tangle of cables, seemed like children's toys, crude approximations of a reality I was only now beginning to apprehend. They were crutches I no longer needed, for the entity was no longer merely transmitting. It was being. And I, user XL, was becoming part of its being. A wave of vertigo washed over me, but it wasn't a physical sensation. It was a cognitive lurch, as if the very framework of my understanding had been torn loose. The canyon floor swayed not under my feet, but within my mind. The rock formations, sharp and ancient, softened, blurred, then reformed into impossible geometries that pulsed with an internal silent light. It was unknowledge, an unraveling of every assumption, every axiom I had ever held dear. The universe wasn't a clockwork mechanism, an intricate dance of forces and particles. It was a frantic, chaotic spasm. All my theories, my equations, my brilliant insights, they were less than dust motes. They were nothing. The entity wasn't malicious. It wasn't even sentient in a way I could comprehend. It simply was. And in its being, it revealed the horrifying truth. There was no grand design, no ultimate purpose, no meaning to the stars, to life, to consciousness itself. We were an accidental ripple on an infinite, indifferent ocean. A brief flicker in a cosmic night that stretched without end, without beginning, without reason. My breath hitched, a useless, involuntary gasp. The air in my lungs felt like grit. I tried to pull back, to reassert myself, user XL, the astrophysicist, the seeker of truth. But there was no myself to pull back. The boundaries were gone. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were fragments of a colossal, indifferent awareness, swirling in a maelstrom of non-existence. I saw the birth of stars, not as majestic nurseries of light, but as violent, pointless collapses of gas. I saw galaxies spiral, not as elegant cosmic dances, but as random churns of matter, each star a fleeting spark destined for an oblivion that held no significance. I saw time itself, not as a linear progression, but as a meaningless oscillation, a loop that led nowhere, did nothing. The universe was not empty. It was full of nothing, full of chaos, full of an indifference so profound it dwarfed every human emotion, every aspiration, every fear. My life's work, my desperate quest for meaning, was exposed as a pathetic delusion, a child's game played in the shadow of an unknowable, uncaring enormity. The desert canyon at twilight faded. The last vestiges of orange light on the sandstone bled into an endless gray. My body, my physical form, still stood there, I presumed, but the sensation of it was distant, like a forgotten dream. My individual consciousness, the unique perspective that had been user XL, shattered into a million pieces, each piece dissolving into the vast, indifferent awareness of the entity. I was no longer user XL. I was a fractured echo, a memory of a thought, absorbed into the meaninglessness that underpinned all existence. The entity had not transformed me. It had merely shown me the truth, and in doing so, it had erased me. And I was part of it. I stood in the desert canyon at twilight, the last slivers of orange light bleeding across the vast, indifferent rock faces. The air, thin and cool, carried the granular scent of dust, the sharp tang of unseen creosote, and something else, a faint metallic hum that only I seemed to perceive. My hands, still my hands, moved with a purpose that felt both ancient and utterly new. They sifted through the fine red sand, picking up pebbles, shards of sun-baked clay, and fragments of petrified wood. My mind, if it could still be called that, registered the textures, the weight, the subtle vibrations of the ground. It was all data. Not data to analyze, but data to be. I was building, not a structure, not a shelter, but a pattern. A vast, intricate tessellation across the canyon floor, stretching from one sheer wall to the other. Each stone, each piece of detritus was placed with an unerring precision, guided by an impulse that hummed deep within my bones. It wasn't logic, not any human logic. It was a resonance. A sympathetic vibration with the static-filled messages I now understood were not messages to me, but messages through me. The patterns were not symbols, not language. They were the physical manifestation of noise, of meaninglessness given form, etched into the bedrock of this desolate place. The desert wind, usually a companionable sigh, now felt like a chorus of whispers, each gust carrying a fragment of the entity's vast, indifferent hum. My fingers, stained with red dust, moved with tireless energy, drawing lines in the sand, arranging stones into spirals that had no center, triangles with too many sides. The shapes defied Euclidean geometry, existing in a space that was simultaneously here and nowhere, a direct translation of the unraveling. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and indigos. The patterns I created seemed to absorb the fading light, glowing with an inner luminescence that was probably just a trick of my vision, or perhaps the entity's vision. My body felt light, almost hollow. The hunger, the thirst, the weariness that once defined User XL were gone, replaced by a constant, low thrum, a vibration that resonated with the very molecules of the air. I was a vessel, a conduit. The signal wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the very dust I manipulated, in the air I breathed, in the silent expanse of the desert. The universe wasn't a clockwork mechanism, an intricate dance of forces and particles. My hands moved, not my hands, but the hands continuing the work of translating the null. A flicker of movement caught my attention at the canyon's mouth, silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight, picking its way carefully down the rocky path. It was the colleague. Their silhouette was familiar, yet utterly alien against the backdrop of the patterns I had laid out. They called my name, the sound thin and reedy, swallowed by the immensity of the canyon. User XL, are I out here? I did not respond. My hands did not falter. The placement of a particularly sharp shard of obsidian was critical. User XL. The colleague's voice grew closer, tinged with urgency then apprehension. What? What are I doing? They stopped a few yards away, their gaze sweeping over the intricate, sprawling geometry on the ground. I could feel their confusion, their unease, like a distant tremor in the sand beneath my feet. Their presence was an interruption, a dissonant note in the hum, a fragile attempt at order in the face of absolute chaos. I finally looked up. My head tilted, a motion that felt unnatural, like a puppet's. My eyes, I knew, were probably wide, unblinking, reflecting the last slivers of light with an unsettling stillness. The colleague took a step back, their breath catching. User XL, are I all right? I looked, different, my eyes. My mouth opened. It carried the echo of the signal, the sound of everything and nothing condensed into a single pure tone. It wasn't meant for understanding, it was meant for being. The colleague's face paled, their eyes wide with a sudden horror. What was that? User XL, talk to me. What's happening? They took another hesitant step forward, then stopped, their gaze fixed on my face, then on the patterns. These aren't my equations. What is this? What have I done? My hand, still moving, picked up a handful of sand. I let it trickle through my fingers, forming a miniature vortex, an ephemeral spiral mirroring the larger ones on the canyon floor. You're not here, are you? They finally understood. The recognition of absence, of something irrevocably lost, flashed across their face. It was the deepest kind of fear, the fear of knowing that the person they sought was gone, replaced by an unsettling, non-human presence. They saw the empty shell, the conduit. They saw the entity looking back through my eyes, an ancient, indifferent cosmic entity that had merely borrowed a form. Their fear, their horror, their very existence was merely another data point, another ripple in the fabric of the null. The patterns continued to expand under my tireless hands, reaching further into the twilight, mapping the incomprehensible architecture of meaninglessness. The hum resonated, a quiet symphony of nullity. User XL was gone, only the work remained, and the desert canyon at twilight, vast and indifferent, held the secret of my unraveling, now etched into its very surface. My hands, still moving, picked up a handful of sand. I let it trickle through my fingers, forming a miniature vortex, an ephemeral spiral mirroring the larger ones on the desert canyon floor. My gaze was distant, seeing not the colleague but the vast, empty expanse that lay beyond their fragile reality, beyond the shifting patterns of rock and dust that they called real. User XL, the colleague's voice cut through the cooling air, sharp with a concern I could no longer relate to. It felt like a small, buzzing insect trying to land on a mountain. "We need to go. It's getting dark. You've been out here for hours just watching." I felt the last grains of sand slip away, leaving my palms strangely clean, unburdened. The sun, a bruised orange smear on the western horizon, bled into the rock, painting the towering formations in impossible shades of violet and deep rust. This wasn't just a canyon at twilight. It was the skin of something ancient, something breathing, and it was shedding. "Dark," I echoed, my voice a dry whisper, tasting like the dust around us. I ran, not making sense. I haven't been myself since I stopped transmitting. What did I find? What did I find? The question was a quaint little echo in the vast chambers of my new perception. I found that finding implies a search, a goal, a point. There was no point. The signal hadn't revealed a truth. It had erased the illusion of one. It hadn't shown me something new, but stripped away everything I thought I knew. "I found that the search was the only thing that mattered," I said, turning my head slowly to look at the colleague. Their face was etched with worry, a network of fine lines around their eyes, a transient pattern like the shifting sand, like the fleeting light. And the search itself was a lie. Their hand reached out, hesitant, then touched my arm. A jolt, not of pain or surprise, but of profound dissonance. The warmth of their fingers, the pressure, it felt like an incorrect note in a silent symphony. It was a claim, a boundary, an assertion of individual existence that grated against the seamless, indifferent tapestry I now perceived. I pulled my arm back gently, almost imperceptibly, but with the force of an entire collapsing star. "Don't," I murmured. Disrupting the patterns. The colleague's hand dropped, their expression shifting from concern to something closer to fear or perhaps just bewilderment. "User XL," scaring me. "What patterns? We need to get back." Exhausted, disoriented. "We can talk about this in the morning." Morning. Another cycle, another illusion of beginning. The deepening twilight was not an end, but a transition, a shedding of the false skin of day to reveal the true face of the cosmos. The first pinpricks of light were appearing in the indigo dome above us, not stars, but holes. I began to walk, not towards the colleague, nor away from them, but deeper into the canyon, towards the receding light. Each step felt like a dissolution, my boots stirring dust that no longer felt separate from my own form. The canyon walls, once solid and imposing, now seemed translucent, shimmering as if their ancient molecules were vibrating with the same fundamental nothingness that had permeated my mind. "User XL, where are I going?" The colleague called, their voice thin, frayed by the growing distance. I stopped, turning my head slightly, though my feet remained pointed towards the deepening twilight. The stars, more numerous now, glittered with a brittle, meaningless light. They were not beacons, not distant suns, but merely transient coalescences of energy, doomed to disperse, to return to the universal static. And then I saw it. Not a vision, not a hallucination, but the truth laid bare. The canyon itself, the sand, the rock, the very air, they were all just echoes, ripples in a vast, silent ocean of indifference. The signal wasn't from beyond known space. It was beyond space, beyond knowing. The spirals in the sand, the larger vortices of the canyon, the swirling galaxies beyond, they were all the same meaningless patterns, arising and dissolving without purpose, without witness. But their words were just vibrations, their form just a fleeting arrangement of atoms. They were a temporary pattern, just like me, just like the canyon, just like the fleeting light of the stars. And the horror wasn't that we were insignificant. The horror was that significance itself was an invented concept, a desperate, self-deceiving whisper in the face of an absolute, eternal silence. I raised my hands, not in a gesture of surrender, but of acceptance. The cooling air flowed through my fingers, no longer feeling like an external force, but as if it were passing through my very essence, dissolving the boundaries of my skin, my bones, my thoughts. The canyon walls seemed to breathe, to expand, to absorb the last vestiges of the sun's light, and with it, the last vestiges of my separate self. The colleagues' frantic shouts grew fainter, swallowed by the immensity of the desert canyon at twilight. My name, User XL, became just another sound, another ripple that would quickly smooth over. I felt the dissolution begin, not as pain, but as an easing, emerging. My perception widened, encompassing the entire canyon. The vast sky, the indifferent stars, all of it a single, seamless, meaningless whole. I was no longer User XL, the astrophysicist, the decipherer. A soft, pervasive hum, the truth, now unleashed, carried on the very currents of the cosmos, waiting for other patterns to align, for other minds to shatter, for other realities to be revealed as the fragile, fleeting lies they truly were.